Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South Project Roundtable. This is our weekly get-together, well, kind of weekly get-together. We really try to make it a weekly get-together with our editors to talk about all the different stories that we've covered this week. And as always, I'm joined by Africa editor Geronima, joining us from the beautiful island of Mauritius, and managing editor Cobus van Staden from, you're in Johannesburg today. I can tell by your background,
yes,
not the
my
beautiful
dad's
city of Cape
crazy,
Town.
crazy study.
I think that looks like an awesome YouTube background set. So,
Yeah.
I mean, if you had almost like the Google virtual backgrounds, that would be one of them. So mine's a little bit less interesting. We've got three cool stories to bring you this week. These are stories that we've covered in depth at the China Global South Project in our newsletters and our podcasts and various videos and for all the different outputs that we do. And we want to get Cobus's and Géraud's take on some of the big stories. So we're going to talk about number one, Cobus spent some time in Zambia with U.S. lawmakers, and we're going to talk about the U.S. Africa and foreign policy narrative versus the realities, and just some reflections on where we are today in Trump world when it comes to foreign policy in Africa and other parts of the world. Then we're going to dive into a very, very busy week for Chinese foreign policy in South Asia. This has been a whirlwind tour for Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who started in India, then he went to Afghanistan, then he ended the week in Pakistan. We're going to run you through all of that. And finally, we're going to end on a very lively week, especially on X, about Somaliland. And this is this little tiny speck of a breakaway nation in the Horn of Africa that wants to have recognition, and a very powerful American senator threw his weight behind it and sparked a lot of discussion. We're going to get into that, and we might even have some difference of opinion between Géraud and myself on this one. So it doesn't happen very often on our podcast where we disagree, but this one we might actually have a little bit of disagreement. So let's get started, Cobus, with you. You had a chance to speak and to participate in a conference. It was Chatham House rules, so you can't tell us who said what, but you can give us the vibe where you had a chance to speak with visiting congressional delegation that went to Zambia. And it was just an opportunity where you could actually meet them in person. You got to listen to some of the conversations that they had with some of the highest levels of the Zambian government. China was very much on their minds. Tell us a little bit about this excursion that you had in Zambia.
So this was an excursion that brought together senior bipartisan Congress people, and I think 2 senators also involved. And they were meeting with high-level Zambian officials, as well as with a group of other very high-level people, particularly focusing on food security and on health security. So these would be very senior people in the vaccine space globally, in kind of in HIV, TB, malaria research and care provision and so on. So a lot of this was focused on, in the first place, kind of trying to convince them to lobby for some of the health funding to be maintained, health and food security funding to be maintained. So there was a lot of focus on the the massive kind of like positive benefits that something like PEPFAR had, and then also a lot of pretty kind of frank discussions with Zambian stakeholders where the issue of China came up. And so it was very interesting to listen to. One really got a feeling that the two sides are not on the same page. From the African side, I think there was, okay. So from the US side, and as we'll highlight, there is a very strong focus at the moment about kind of competition with China, and so a lot of the presence in Africa and the future of the US presence in Africa is framed through this. Like, are we winning with China on X and Y, where something like minerals, for example, is very prominent. From the African side, I think they come from from a perspective, I think, that for so long the US has been like this kind of single sun in the sky, and the rest of us are all planets around them, right? Now there's 2 suns, and and you're kind of being chided by the one or the other, depending on on perceptions that you look into close. So from the African side, they were trying to kind of, they find themselves in a very excluded position in the global system. They were trying to diversify their connections. Now that's being framed as a kind of a betrayal of the US. And so I think so that was a point of friction, and with the Africans saying that, look, kind of, we are also sovereign countries, and we need to diversify our ties as we see fit. And then with the some of US stakeholders kind of complaining that for all of their inputs, not only like aid inputs, but also other kinds of forms of cooperation, they're not getting the kind of like attention and cooperation from African governments as they feel China's getting. So it came
quick
down
pause
wrong
there.
this way.
I just want to get Giro's reaction to this. You've spent time in Washington. You interact quite a bit with U.S. stakeholders. You also obviously live in Mauritius, and you're from the DRC. Talk to us a little bit about what you're hearing in terms of, does this make sense in light of everything? What's your reaction when you hear that American lawmakers are a little bit pissed off over the fact that they don't feel appreciated by Africans?
I'm not really surprised given the current circumstances. We've seen over the few months since January, we've seen how even since the Biden administration, we saw how the U.S. Congress has become that place where there is a strong anti-China sentiment growing and brewing, and becoming the place where all the, I wouldn't say the nasty, but all the fake news and nasty, sometimes bizarre narrative around Chinese engagement in Africa or elsewhere in the global south are coming from in the US. So seeing them in an event like this, having this kind of narrative, I'm not really surprised. If they would say the contrary, I would have been surprised. And seeing them also being there, trying to now kind of fix what a kind of US engagement would look like after the dismantling of USAID, after the withdrawal of so many American aid programs. So I'm not really surprised by that. And of course, being in Zambia, close to the DRC, in the region of the Cobalt Belt or the Copper Belt, and all the Lobito Corridor project, I'm not really surprised as well that they use China as the entry point in terms of conversation, in terms of expressing their frustration. But for me, my question is, like, Kobus, who you were there, do you have the sense that this time around they know exactly what they want in their engagement in Africa? They recognize that USAID is dead, is not there anymore, but they want to remain relevant in that space. And we remember, Eric, that
I was curious about that myself.
They were also kind of worried about the fact that what's going to happen with the space they're leaving out for China to fill that space. Do you have the sense that this time when they came around, they knew exactly what they wanted?
And just one other little fine point to add on to that, in addition to USAID dying, there was always questions about the fate of AGOA, but AGOA now is effectively dead because there are now tariffs on every African country. The duty-free access into the U.S. is no longer there. So the two main levers of U.S. influence in military is still there, but that wasn't discussed. But aid and trade are off the table. And so just to pick up on what Giro was saying, was that present in the discussions that you were having?
I found it a lot more present in some of some like viewpoints of some of the people than others, and I would say that the majority of them was still quite embedded in the idea that the US gives a lot of foreign assistance to Africa. So there was a revealing moment where they were talking about all of the different kind of like pros and cons, all of the different ways of like how they're benefiting or not from their foreign assistance, and then halfway through the discussion, one person was like, "Well, we should also talk about the fact that most of this has now been cancelled." So it was an interesting kind of like feeling that almost the lag of that cooperation was still with some of them. Others were, I think, a lot more focused on trying to build deals for some kind of post-aid, world. And so there was a very prominent presence from the US mining company Cobalt, which kind of uses AI and so on to prospect for new minerals, and is particularly focused on cobalt and copper and so on. And they have a big presence in Zambia. And so that was also presented as a as another example of what a kind of a positive, mutually beneficial post-aid kind of collaboration could look like. But of course, it's very based on minerals and not really the wider society.
Giro, let's pick up the conversation there, because one of the points of frustration that I have when we have this discussion about US-China competition in Africa, critical minerals ends up becoming the focal point of this. And the part that I get frustrated is the fact that it's not really a competition. I mean, we just saw in the past week that Qingsan, which is one of the largest steel manufacturers in China, just dropped $800 million into Zambia, or at least announced a deal for $800 million on top of billions that they've already committed into Zambia. This is, comparable with what we see in the DRC as well, where CMOC Group, Zijin, CNMC, any number of these major mining companies have invested billions of dollars. And yet cobalt is often held up, as we've just heard from Cobus, as the evidence that there is a competition. But when you look at the scale, it doesn't feel like there's any competition. Now, I'm not an expert in this field. You are. Tell us about this sense of competition between the US and China for critical minerals with companies like cobalt.
There's not really competition happening on the ground, because competition, you have to really having something you really have to be on par with the one you are competing with in terms of engagement, in terms of the size of your engagement. But the reality is US companies or Western companies are not really competing in that space with China. And cobalt, yes, I think I would say it's a new kids in the block, really trying to make its space in a country like Zambia, also now extending its operation in the DRC. But when you compare to what Chinese state-owned companies or private companies or mixed-owned companies are doing in terms of investment in both Zambia and DRC, in Zimbabwe, elsewhere in the Southern African region, there's no comparison possible. So the narrative of competition is really not I don't think it's a very accurate way of presenting things, because they are not even fighting in the same league. They don't really not in the same space of
you validated what I was thinking there. I want to share a clip for you from an exchange that took place in Bogota, Colombia last week. Now you think to yourself, what does this have to do with our discussion about Zambia, China, Africa? But it's very, very interesting, because 2 US senators went to Colombia, and Bernie Moreno is the US senator from Ohio, who is of Colombian descent. He is very much a pro-Trump, MAGA, America First member of the coalition. And he had some very interesting reflections on the frustrations that he has towards Colombia, which I thought would be very relevant and similar to what you heard in Zambia. It's a little bit of a long clip. It's about 3 minutes, but I think it's very interesting and reveals a lot about the current thinking in Washington.
Think about your best friend, and you go out to dinner often, and he buys, they buy, we buy, they buy. But sometimes, you're buying 5 times in a row, it gets a little annoying. If you look at what America has given Colombia over the last 30 or 40, 50 years, it's tens of billions of dollars of direct aid, direct money, checks transferred. Colombia's never given the US $1 in foreign aid. It's a fact. And then when you have a relationship like that, and then we're talking about, okay, what are we going to do with our telecommunications infrastructure? Saying, well, we're looking at China. It's a problem. It's a little bit of a slap in the face, quite honestly, when the reality should be, my God, of course, we would never consider having a relationship with somebody who's a strategic threat to your country and strategic competitor. And we're going to, of course, always side with looking at those types of things. We solved something today, hopefully, in the auto industry, where we have European safety standards for cars that come here, which would block American cars. I mean, that's a slap in the face. So when you say what strains relationships, those are the things that strain relationships. And I also want to just dig one level deeper, because I had the pleasure of, and I think Ruben will say, it's truly a pleasure when you go out and campaign and you go day to day, 14, 15, 16, 18 hours a day, and you go to every corner of the state talking to real people who work for a living and all kinds of professions. And if I walked into a random coffee shop in Chillicothe, Ohio, and I just talked to the first person I met there, who could have been a truck driver, somebody who works at the Kenworth factory, somebody who works at the VA, you name it, and said, hey, how much foreign aid should we give anybody? The answer would be 0. And I want you to understand that's the feeling of America today. That's different than the feeling it was in the mid-90s when we had a surplus, when our total debt was a low number of only $15 trillion. and now it's 37 trillion. And there's a feeling like our industry got hurt, that these factories that once employed this person at that coffee shop in Chillicothe, that factory now exists in a foreign country, not because they didn't do the right job, but because they were chasing lower cost labor. That's just a reality. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that when we say America first, it means America only or America alone. It means that we have to understand we're just in a different place. And when you're making these decisions, it can't just be, hey, we have a challenge in Colombia, you, America, must fix this, when at the same time, you're saying we're engaging with your strategic adversary. That's a problem. And I think we need government partners and friends that just understand you have a 203-year relationship. You can't have the new person on the block all of a sudden attract your attention, because that creates animosities in personal relationships too.
Cobus, I suspect that you heard some sentiments of that in Zambia, this sense that we've done so much. I think it's interesting, the framing that he suggested. And by the end, he said at the end, a 200-300-year relationship. And let's remember what the U.S. relationship with Central and South America was for much of that 200 or 300. It was highly extractive. And so this idea that never has Colombia given $1 to the United States, I think there would be a lot of dispute about that in terms of the equity of the relationship over this 300-year span, but we'll leave that for historians. But that mood that he represented there, if in that coffee shop in Ohio, where he said, how much foreign aid should we give? Not $1. I don't know if that was understood by some of the Zambians that were on the other side of the table, that's based on what you're saying.
I think they understood it. I mean, particularly on the kind of high, high end of the government. I would add to that, like, like obviously in the Latin America context specifically, some of the like ongoing US kind of political involvement in large parts of Latin America over the last 100, 200 years has also been a very significant factor in the kind of destabilization of those societies that ended up causing some of these problems, right? So that's one. The other thing that I would gently push back on from him is that there is this framing, and it's an understandable framing, but like there's this framing at the moment, I think, in the US that aid is something that they give and other people receive, right? But some of the very kind of core like biggest and most successful of these projects, and PEPFAR is the greatest example, which is the HIV and AIDS kind of like landmark program that the US has done in Africa. Like a lot of those programs are co-created kind of like clinical trials and vaccine development, these kind of things that will benefit the US too. I mean, the US has a big HIV positive population. A city like DC, for example,
no, Cobus, I am sorry to interrupt you, but again, we have an administration in the United States that does not believe in vaccines and is taking down the vaccine infrastructure.
Well, exactly.
So
that's the bigger problem.
I don't know
right?
if you can say that this will benefit the United States if there's no infrastructure to receive that information, and if they don't believe in the value of vaccines. So that's old America, not current America.
Yes, but still, but those that doesn't take away from like how those projects were created, right? Kind of what those projects constituted, and they, the real winners from those projects, because it's not are U.S. drug companies, right? Kind of because a lot of what PEPFAR was doing field trials in places like South Africa, right? Kind of for the rollout of things that are in the longer run going to make these companies a lot of money.
Yeah.
So
that's a hard sell politically to make.
Well, obviously because we're in MAGA world and and up is down and and so on. But so the larger issue that I was also kind of like gently pointing out to them is that in this kind of moment where trade has been hobbled and where US foreign assistance is largely disappearing, and where pop culture influence is rapidly eroding, right? Kind of because US pop culture, Africa has its own pop stars. It doesn't need US pop stars. It has an actual legitimate youth wave, whereas like obviously the average age in the US is in its 40s. So Africa is moving ahead on the pop culture thing. Like kind of they like pop culture, US pop culture influence is eroding. So with all of that in context, like what ends up happening is that the US is like position in Africa reduces to military only. And so that in the wider kind of influence building sense does leave the space open for China, not to replace something like USAID, but for example to sell cheap cell phones, kind of, and just kind of connect those, make kind of like educational connections and stuff like that. So I was pointing that out to them as well.
I want to pick up on the point that he made, and Joe, I want you to jump in on this, that he felt, and again, this could absolutely apply to Zambia, where he said, listen, we have given billions of dollars, and there is no dispute that the United States for decades was the largest provider of humanitarian and health assistance to Africa. No, that's indisputable. Okay.
Yeah.
And this sense that what Senator Moreno said is we've given billions of dollars, and yet it's a slap in the face that you turn around and you engage Huawei when you know that is our strategic rival. You could have engaged Ericsson. You could have engaged Nokia, any Samsung for similar 5G technology. It might have been more expensive, but that's the price that friends pay for one another. We've given you $1 billion. You should be able to make a sacrifice as well. But I mean, you laugh, but that's what they want, and that's what they say, and that's what they feel hurt by.
You did not give me $1 billion to change structurally my economy to be able to afford what you're offering. You do not give me $1 billion to make a kind of change that's going to really take me up the value chain of international.
No. But Jérôme, here's the catch. And this came out at in some of the USAID discussions. Some African health ministers were not putting much money into their budgets because they said the U.S. took care of it. So there was giving you money for your economy that you didn't have to spend on health, that they then turned around, that could have been spent then, that extra money on network infrastructure, not from Huawei. That's the thinking that they would have.
No, this is not true. This is not true. That framing is completely not true. Here, I'm going to remind you one of the discussions we had a few months back during our trip, when we had an official that was working for that was privy to the conversation of the USAID, where we learned that when the USAID was dismantled, now African government were trying to find out which program the USAID was financing, which tells you that basically that USAID was designing and framing those project without necessarily telling the local government what they were doing with that. When they were building school, when they're building hospitals and school and all of that, they were choosing which partner to work with, where the money is going to go through. They were not like, we're going to put money into building road, into infrastructure. They were choosing deliberately, they were choosing humanitarian causes. So they cannot be coming and say, there was just money laying there around waiting for you to choose where you're going to send the money. That's not true. That's completely not true.
So you're unsympathetic to Senator Moreno. When you hear that it's a slap in the face,
I'm completely unsympathetic to his claim, to his statement, because you cannot take that statement out of the context of international system. You cannot. Any non-developed country can come and say, because we've done that to you, you owe us this, without taking the overall international system, the impact they had on the imbalance of the international system, how they're impacting global South countries. So I'm sorry. I'm completely unsympathetic, because it's taking a very short period of time in this relationship with Colombia. If we extrapolate it in the case of Zambia or Africa, for example, let's bring that in the case of Zambia and Africa. You like taking that example. Do you think that the US can come and say, we've given $1 billion to the DRC in terms of aid, and we are not happy that you are friend to China, without mentioning your responsibility in Lumumba crisis, without mentioning your responsibility?
Are you asking that as a legitimate question or as a rhetorical question? Because if you want an answer, yes, the Americans would absolutely 100% do that, as they just did in Colombia.
Exactly. So this is not.
Again, a congressman says it. Fair enough. Exactly. It's not the American government.
Exactly. The hypocrisy of all of that. Just to say, you cannot just take a snapshot of your engagement in our countries or in our region outside the context of your own responsibility of the international system, on how it works and how it's shaped.
Jérôme, just to be clear, you can do it. People don't take you seriously. They will do it. One other thing, Cobus, that Senator Moreno said, which we didn't have in this soundbite, but you will recognize this rhetoric that he said. He said, Colombia cannot be partners with China and the United States. You must either be with us or you are with them, but you are not both. We heard that same rhetoric coming into South Africa. And by the way, now, The United States is launching an investigation into South Africa's relationship with Iran. So we're now going down yet more contentious, pathways between the US and South Africa. I have a feeling this rhetoric of us or them is going to become even more prominent and will move from the legislature into the executive. What do you think when you hear this, Cobus?
It makes me anxious, I have to admit, because I think one of the effects will be for some countries, and I can't say which specifically, but like for some countries, I think it's going to be like, well, them then. So because they're kind of forcing a choice, and they're making the choice really easy by at the same time cutting trade, right? Kind of so it's all sticks, no carrots, right, at the moment. And so in particularly if if countries already have massive kind of trade relationships with China, and they're doing project finance, and they're sending phones and all of these things, then replacing all of those things from the US is a long shot, right? Like how are you going to be convincing the Trump administration to step into these different fields, because they're going to be like nickel and diming you, right? So I think that the longer term effect is a kind of comes down more to a withdrawal of US influence, I think, than a kind of a forcing of a choice, right? Because if you're forcing a choice, then you also have to kind of like acknowledge why they were working with China to begin with, which is there's a whole bunch of stuff they couldn't get out of the kind of Western-led system, right? Kind of a lot of these countries are very, very distant from China. They don't have close relationships with China, right? Kind of like a lot of them would actually kind of prefer to work with Western partners because they are more known entities for them, but they ended up working with China because they felt that there was a lot of barriers to getting what they need. And one of the kind of off the record, one of the Zambian stakeholders there was kind of like saying, in a low voice, like, yeah, so what's the offer here? Is it basically we want you to stay poor and at our service forever? Is that really the only thing that you're really offering?
Okay.
Which I mean is a tough take on it, but here we are.
So Giraud, you're going to get the last word on this before we move on to our next topic. Give us, throw it down for us. Tell us the bottom line.
No offer on the table, just narrative, just talks, and an ability to fill the gap that our countries need drastically. Just coming, as I'm just here gonna quote a mining executive from the DRC saying, I'm coming to your country. I spent the first hour you telling me why it's not good for you to work, why it's not good for me to work with China. The next hour, it's you telling me why you cannot be working with me. So at the end, I've spent 2 hours at the end finding myself with no option at all. I'm going to pick China all the time. Simple as that. I mean, come on.
Okay, let's move on to our next topic, and this one is pretty exciting. Cobus and I have been covering this all week. This isn't really in Giraud's wheelhouse, but nonetheless, it's going to be something we'd like for you to comment on. Here is Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi meeting with Ajit Doval as one of the first meetings that he did when he undertook his week-long visit to South Asia. Let me just try and run you through the itinerary very quickly. He started in India, and on Monday he met with Ajit Doval, who you're seeing in the talks here. And again, Wang Yi wears a lot of different titles. So in addition to being foreign minister, he is also the special representative of Chinese President Xi Jinping on the boundary question. And here he's meeting with Ajit Doval, who is the national security advisor for India, who is also a special representative, in this case of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, also on the boundary question. The boundary, and those of you who are not familiar with this story, is the core issue right now in the China-India relationship, and it has been the reason why for the past 5 years there's been a freeze in the relationship that is now starting to show real signs of thawing. But back in 2020, in May of 2020, there was an incident called the Galwan Valley incident, where about 20 Indian soldiers were killed in a confrontation with the Chinese. And since then, the relationship just went into a tailspin. Now, though, over the past year, we've seen this détente that has picked up, and Wang Yi went to India in a very high-profile visit for a two-day visit, where he met with Ajit Doval to talk about the border and boundary issues. Then later, he met with his counterpart, S. Jaishankar, who is the external affairs minister. And then on Tuesday, before he left, he had a very rare meeting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And I say a rare meeting because normally the Indian Prime Minister does not meet with visiting foreign ministers. It's a protocol issue. So in this case, they bent protocol. He met at the residence, not in the official office. But nonetheless, he met. And one of the reasons why they got together is because Narendra Modi, for the first time in 7 years, is going to be going up to China for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. And there is a lot of expectation that Modi is going to have a bilateral meeting on the sidelines with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And this will accelerate the rapprochement between the two sides. Now, Russian propaganda is really starting to have a field day with this, and they're saying from rivals to allies, India and China redefining their relations and forging a future of strategic harmony. And then, Evan Feigenbaum, who has, if you're not following Evan Feigenbaum's Twitter feed or X feed right now, you really should be. He is one of the most influential foreign policy thinkers in Washington. He spent a good part of his career working in the U.S. government to forge the U.S.-India relationship that has now just completely blown up. And he pointed out that allies, quote unquote, comedy gold. But Cobus, you see what the Russians are trying to do is to paint a narrative that says, because the U.S.-India relationship is just imploding right now for a number of reasons, that this is going to bring some kind of alliance between India and China. Most experts think that is absolutely absurd, that what they're trying to do is just get back to zero, not get to some, beautiful partnership and alliance. So very last point that I'll make before I turn it over to you, Cobus, for your reflections on the India portion of the trip, is they have agreed to restart direct flights between the two countries, which had been frozen. They've restarted some exports that were under export controls, urea, which is a fertilizer, also tunnel boring equipment, and then some other technologies. So there is this rapprochement that is happening. The border talks are going well. Cobus, you were writing about this all week. What is your take on it all?
There's in addition to all of these different forms of new linkages, the travel and the boring machines and so on, there's also notably that there were reports that China is easing export curbs on rare earth minerals and particularly on high-powered magnets created with rare earth minerals. So that was a big thing, because when China earlier this year restricted all of those exports as part of its larger kind of fight with the US, Indian automakers were really freaking out about that, and so this is a significant gesture. I think, like our colleague Obert Bore was raising doubts about how long this will last, but let's see. So you mentioned about Russia, like Russia is also calling for trilateral talks between the three of them towards some kind of Eurasian collective, which I also found funny, because I think the idea of a unified axis between even China and Russia, even as close as they relatively are to each other now, we know that there's a lot of issues in that relationship. It's not an easy relationship, and it's even more true for the India-China relationship, right? So there's a lot of stuff there that as you say, that in general they're trying to just get it back to zero rather than like this new blooming pan-Asian embrace. So I would say though that the level they're doing it at was notable, and I was wondering if it's just simply that the optics of the meetings and so on was meant to send messages to the West.
Absolutely, the optics were meant to send messages, and also I just want to point out one other optical message that happened on Wednesday, the day after Wang Yi left. And again, there is no way that this is an accident. The Indian military launched a test fire of its Agni 5 ballistic missile that is nuclear capable. That is has a 5,000 kilometer range, which means that it can reach any point in China. Who else would the Indians want to target a nuclear weapon at?
And the Indian media was like that was what they were running with. All the headlines were like, oh, they can now hit any part in China. So that was clearly also part of the kind of rollout messaging.
And let's not forget the narrative that Beijing on its side is also preparing to showcase new military weapons for its upcoming military.
That's right.
That's going to come up. So that's all of that is playing into it all plays into a very complex narrative of China-India relationship, where at the same time they're in BRICS and at the same time they cannot get along easily, which at some point I understand why Russia is trying really to play into that, into that rapprochement somehow, to portray it as highlights of big relationship, because in a context where they know they have to face the US and they have to face what they call unilateralism of diplomacy that are taking place right now, they're trying as much as possible, as Eric you're saying, to get things to zero level, just to allow us, if we can stop at least the fight, the bickering for a certain extent, but we also have to be able to manage things. But there's also something that we have to take into account. Inside India, there's no unanimity on how to approach China. There are certain factions within Modi government where they're really much more hawkish against China. So those are also the issue that's also playing out on how India is approaching China and how they're managing all of that. The kind of game that Modi himself is playing within its own political party, within its own apparatus, to be able to engage China in a way that remain to a amicable or acceptable level. Yeah.
Okay. I want to play a sound clip here from Chinese Ambassador Xu Feihong, who right after Wang Yi left, there was a forum on China-India relations. And there is an amazing statement here. And then again, you can see it on the screen. And this is rhetoric that we would not have heard from a Chinese ambassador 12 months ago.
Jointly uphold international justice.
So,
at present,
yes.
Tariff wars and trade wars are disrupting the global economic and trade system. Power politics and the law of the jungle are prevalent, and the international rules and order have suffered severe impacts. The Global South is highly concerned about how China and India can strengthen cooperation and take the lead to help developing countries overcome difficulties and safeguard international fairness and justice. The essence of trade is to complement each other's advantages and achieve mutual benefits and win-win results, not a calculation of who loses and who gains, nor should it become a tool for pursuing individual selfish interests. The United States has long been benefited greatly from free trade, but now it is using tariffs as a bargaining chip to demand exorbitant prices from various countries. The United States has imposed tariffs of up to 50% on India and even threatened for more. China firmly opposes it. In the face of such acts, silence or compromise only emboldens the bully. China will firmly stand with India to uphold the multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization at its core. Jointly uphold.
Amazing, Cobus. You would not have seen that a year ago, that China stands with India. That is not something we would have heard. Here is a very powerful ambassador specifically calling out the United States as a bully. China in taking the mantle of leadership of the global South. And this is something that is contested between India and China. Both see themselves as leaders of the global South. But Cobus, when you hear Ambassador Xu's comments, what do you think?
Well, the first thing that came up for me was that the call that line of, silence or compromise only emboldens the bully. That is, I heard it before he was saying it. I heard it from a Japanese politician, which was even more notable. So that is, like showing real kind of like emerging gaps, kind of in relationships that I think everyone assumed were fully rock solid, right? So I think I think it signals to a kind of a larger, beyond China kind of like emerging kind of talking point. But yeah, it is notable, and I think this, like it was very interesting for me. Like one of the in back in Zambia when I was there, one of the high level US stakeholders was talking about South Africa's membership of BRICS, the very fact of its membership, not anything it did within BRICS, but just the fact that it joined BRICS to begin with, as a again as kind of slap in the face of the US. And it was interesting for me because I thought it's so interesting to hear it from that side, because from the other side, all of these countries have such beefs with each other within BRICS, and
Exactly.
yet they can find ways to, BRICS is a place where they put all those things to side and try and cobble together some shared thing, which everyone knows is super weak.
Let's not
right?
oversell BRICS, though, Cobus. I mean,
No, but that's what I mean. Is everyone knows whatever consensus you get in BRICS is super weak, right? Kind of like BRICS has no implementing, no nothing. But it still is a space where like what I mean is it creates this interesting space, and it's not the only one. Like SCO, a lot of these other ones also do it. It creates a space where the beef that you have with someone isn't the only thing that you can see. Right, kind of that there's some kind of like space of cooperation.
I agree with you,
And-
but let's not forget, at the last BRICS foreign ministers gathering, there was no communique that was issued because the African delegations there couldn't agree. Remember, at the last SCO in response
I'm not,
to
I'm not advocating for a
no, but just
like,
just in the SCO in response to the Israel and American attacks on Iran, they issued a statement without including India because they knew India would have vetoed that. So again, I just don't want to present these groups as harmonious
actually.
in that respect.
Exactly, but that's what I mean, is that they don't have to be harmonious.
Yes.
Like they kind of give themselves a license to not have to be harmonious.
Okay.
And finding ways of still finding like some overlaps and specific things they want to work together on. Like that is an interesting, different approach to the kind of zero sum, like slap in the face kind of like line that is coming out of
100%.
MAGA world now.
And the Americans are back in zero sum. Let me just keep on with our journey right now, because we have a lot of room, still places to go. Where Wang Yi immediately after, and this was very difficult for us to figure out what his itinerary was. It would be so much easier if the Chinese foreign minister would publish his itinerary. Monday here, Tuesday there, Wednesday there. They don't do that. So you have to kind of read through various things. We thought he was going to go to Islamabad right after India. He didn't. He made a stop in Afghanistan, in Kabul, where he met with both the Afghan foreign minister and the Pakistani foreign minister for a first ever trilateral foreign ministers gathering in Afghanistan. There is talk in Afghanistan now of bringing Afghan into the China-Pakistan economic corridor to link those two together, which is effectively an extension of the Belt and Road Initiative. That is the discussion that they're having there in Pakistan, in Islamabad. I'm sorry, getting confused here. In Kabul. Later, he did on Thursday eventually make it to Islamabad. Now, this is a very interesting part of the meeting. Not only does it serve to balance the visit to India, which is always very important, but more importantly is that the Chinese relationship with Pakistan is as strong as it gets of any two countries in Asia today. However, remember, one of the reasons why the U.S.-India relationship soured is in part because one of Pakistan's most senior military officials showed up in the White House in June, and that made Modi absolutely furious. It must be a little bit of a point of concern that the Pakistanis are re-engaging the Americans after a 10-year, time apart, we'll call it. After it was this is a very complex relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan, but Trump seems to think that there are critical minerals and there's oil and there's all sorts of good things in Pakistan. And so here, I think Wang is trying to make sure that the Pakistanis remember who their best friend is in the world, and it is certainly China. So, Cobus, at the end of the week, we did cover quite a bit of what Wang was doing in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Hard to keep up with his travel, but very, very interesting in terms of all the different maneuvers that are underway.
Yeah, it's I was looking at it from the perspective of neighborhood diplomacy, and this is kind of omnidirectional foreign policy that China frequently employs. So what was interesting for me, obviously, in the first place, they plan to more formally fold Afghanistan into the Belt and Road. There was a lot of talk about extending the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is a key Belt and Road development, to Afghanistan, to bring kind of Afghan kind of engagement in there. And my feeling was that there's two big, or maybe three big things on the table. One is Afghanistan has huge mineral reserves, right? Kind of so mining, I think, is definitely on the table, and they were actually discussing mining. Second place, I think some internal Chinese security calculus about Xinjiang and cross the border and kind of militancy and separatist militias, I think is probably in there. Or I saw that mentioned on Twitter as well by Chinese stakeholders. And then I think importantly, I think it seemed also aimed to try and get better cooperation between Afghanistan and Pakistan specifically, because the two have been at odds. Pakistan accuses Afghanistan of harboring separatist militias, and some of those separatist militias have attacked Chinese workers on Belt and Road projects. And Afghanistan has also bombed sites in Pakistan. Excuse me. Pakistan has bombed sites in Afghanistan. As part of this kind of like wider kind of like security issues. So I think China is also trying to get those two to kind of work together. Kind of to try and kind of calm down the neighborhood more broadly.
Okay. Let's leave it there on this one. But again, this is probably going to be one of the big stories of 2025 to see how this unfolds. Obviously, no one had on their bingo cards that the U.S.-India relationship would break down. I think the next question is whether or not India thinks that it's worthwhile to remain a member of the U.S.-led Quad security partnership. Now, it may remain a part of it, but it may slow walk it, may not be as enthusiastic a member anymore. Clearly, feelings are hurt in India by what's happened with Donald Trump. They thought that Modi was really good friends with Trump. They thought that, they had him buttoned up, and they miscalculated severely. So this is going to be one of the more interesting relationships to watch. Okay, Géraud, we're coming back to you now. Our final topic today is going to be talking about the little tiny piece of land on the Horn of Africa. Let me just bring this up for everybody. And it is when I say tiny, it's a little speck of land. Tell us a little bit about Somaliland, if you will, and I'll just I'm trying to find the map that I can show everybody.
Now, Somaliland, that's as you call speck of land on the map of in Somali that's claiming its own independence from Somali, and the very historical, difficult relationship with the central government in Mogadishu, and they've been working or fighting for so long to get their own independent country called Somaliland. And they say they have different people, they have different situation, they have different culture and different people. So that's why they're calling on their own independence. And I was talking with one stakeholders in the African Union. There is a feeling that Somaliland has a case to put on the table to kind of make that claim, but yet the feelings are quite different on the African side regarding how people see all the Somaliland debate. But basically, yes, Somaliland, that country, I won't say country, that piece of land that's been claiming its independence.
Not a country yet.
Not a country yet. And then you have some U.S. lawmakers or stakeholders or diplomats to a certain extent that have been
don't mention them by name, by the way.
I'm not
cannot mention them by name.
They've been, lobbying really hard to get Somaliland on the agenda of the Trump administration, so Somaliland can become an independent country. But we know that China has a different view on that.
The reason why I'm asking you not to name them by name is because in the past we have named them by name, and they've reached out to me to say, listen, you can't say that I have done that because there's no proof that I've done that. I'm not registered as a foreign agent of Somaliland. And so, and that is a technical correction. So I want to make sure that we are fair to them as well. But you are 100% right that they have been advocating for Somaliland recognition. Okay, so Géraud, you referenced lawmakers in the United States, and this all started this week when U.S. Senator Ted Cruz from Texas published this tweet. And let me read it for you. Despite these threats, Somaliland remains committed to forging closer ties with the U.S. and is actively engaged in enhancing military cooperation, counterterrorism efforts, and economy and trade partnerships to do so to the greatest effect and the greatest benefit to the American national security interest. It requires the status of a state. I urge you to grant it that recognition. And that set off a whole huge kind of firestorm on X, where everybody got excited. A major reason why the Americans are advocating for Somaliland is because they say Somaliland will be a buffer against the Chinese Communist Party in Africa, in part because Somaliland has this relationship with Taiwan, and it has a trade representative office in each other's. And I think the Somaliland folks have an embassy in Taipei, but there's a trade representative office for Taiwan in Hargeisa. Now, let me just play you some sound from Ted Cruz on a radio show that he did, and that explains a little bit more about what he wanted to do. So let's take a listen very quickly.
We're also going to talk about a story that you may not have seen, but it is consequential, which is that I've been calling for the recognition of a new nation in Africa, Somaliland. And I'm the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Africa. And the Chinese Communist Party is very, very unhappy with me for doing so. And so they have been blasting me this week for daring to stand up to China and Africa. Well, here's a spoiler alert. I'm going to keep standing up to them. But we'll explain that issue to you because it's important, and it's another arena in which we are contesting communist China.
Okay, so you see, China is very much a part of this. What he was referring to was a statement by the Chinese embassy in Somalia that called a U.S. senator, they did not name him by name, and they called it a bullying attitude of certain U.S. politicians to the Somali people. There was also statements coming out from the Taiwan representative office in Somaliland, and the Somalis themselves issued, so there were statements flying all over the place. Cobus, when you hear all of this, we talked about Somaliland on the show, on a podcast couple months ago. What's your take on all of this?
A little bit of disquiet, I think. Specifically, like I've made this point on the podcast before, but like I think for me one of the strongest like examples to like recent kind of precedents to look to in this is South Sudan, which also became a state in the context of very intense lobbying, particularly from U.S. Republicans. It was framed
in the
at
Christian
that stage,
right specifically,
yes,
right?
Exactly. It was framed as that stage as like securing a Christian country from these like from Sudan. And once they became formally independent, they basically like the attention fell off the table, and it like the state was very, very weak and almost immediately fell into civil war, and it's still in civil war. Sudan is now South Sudan is now one of the worst, kind of like, or one of what, like way down on all of the different indices, and the only place where it comes up is occasionally as a new destination for illegal immigrants in the US. So that is like, I don't want to see Somaliland go that way, and it does make me worry that they may go that way. On the other hand, there's a lot of talk about relocating a US base there if it becomes independent. I mean, we'll have to see. It's certainly very, very strategically positioned, right? Right on the kind of on the in the Middle East, on the coast. So we'll see, but like overall, it makes me worried. Like it makes me worried for Somaliland, actually.
Okay, well, let me have a point of difference now with my good friend Jeronima, and I'll make my point, and then we'll let him make his point, and then we would have some difference here. I contend that the likes of Ted Cruz and all of those people in Washington and the United States who are so eager to leverage Somaliland as a way to whack the Chinese are going to be very disappointed, because, Cobus, what you and I heard in our discussion with those two Somaliland political scientists was that there is a chance that if the Somaliland government gets recognition from the United States, that does not constitute recognition as a state. In order to be classified as a country, it has to be recognized by the United Nations. And so long as the Chinese government holds a veto over anything that happens at the United Nations, there is no way on God's green earth that Somaliland will ever achieve diplomatic recognition from the United Nations so long because it's got this relationship with Taiwan. Now, there is a scenario here where in order to get a deal with the Chinese, they cashier their relationship with Taiwan. And that would then pave the way for international recognition at the UN, which is ultimately what they want. And then you could see a bowl of tears in Washington to say, but wait, we thought this was going to be our pathway to whack the Chinese. But in fact, the Chinese have co-opted the Somaliland government in order to give them recognition. I don't believe this will happen necessarily, because what it would ultimately do is it would validate a breakaway territory like Taiwan to get recognition. So that would be a model for Taiwan. But there is a scenario out there where politics could get in the way. Giraud,
who's going to bargain?
Is yours to disagree with me.
Who's going to bargain the Taiwan chip for Somaliland? The U.S. support.
No, the Somalilanders will bargain that away because they want UN recognition, because so long as they don't get UN recognition, they're not a country. And they cannot get UN recognition without China.
Yes, they cannot get UN recognition without China. But if Somaliland doesn't get, first of all, my case, I don't think we disagree on that. There's fundamental. We just have different nuances. And if the US doesn't, they can bargain the fact that they don't recognize Taiwan anymore. They have so they can get support from China. They can get support from China, but I don't see China agreeing on that for a simple reason, because China would set a precedent that's going to open doors to the debate on its own case of Taiwan, which China.
That's right. That's probably why it won't happen. That's probably why it won't happen.
Once you do that,
because they don't want to put that up as a negotiating tactic.
Exactly. It means that now it becomes an element that people can use against you, first of all.
Second of all, if that's the case, Giraud, if that's the case, sorry to interrupt you, then Somaliland recognition at the UN is dead on arrival. It will never happen.
It's dead on arrival, it's dead on arrival not because of China to begin with. It's dead on arrival because there's no wide range support for Somaliland independence within African Union. Because let's face it, China can stand at the UN and say, I'm not going to agree with Somaliland becoming a country, but China will not stand in a way if there is a consensus within the African Union to say, you know what, we do agree on that. And they did the same thing with South Sudan. They did not go forward to say we're against. They were against as long as African Union was not for that. But once the US successfully lobbied every African countries for South Sudan to become independent, once the AU say we are okay with that, in the UN, China said, if Africans are okay with that, we're going to go with that. We're going to be okay with that. But for Somaliland, I don't think that China, the US would be the first priority. And I think they're betting the fact that now that we have a kind of bullying diplomacy taking place, if we get the US support, we're hoping the US now to start maybe bullying or influencing some African countries within Africa to be able to now support the Somaliland stance for independence. But from what we know, from what we see, it's going to be very, very difficult to get wide range of support for Africa to say Somaliland become a country. Because let's not face it, every African country, no African country is shielded from the debate of border dispute of its neighbor somehow. So if you open that door, we already had the door with South Sudan. We know how it's played out. We had the case of Eritrea. We know how it's played out. But if you open the door for Somaliland, now it becomes a free-for-all. So why are we going to stop in Somaliland? Why not we go to the DRC with Rwanda, Eastern DRC?
And also Cameroon, Northern Cameroon, we've got breakaway issues.
So every country knows
Nigeria.
Exactly. Once we open that door, there's no closing it anymore. There's no closing it anymore. Yeah.
Very few African borders were drawn by African people, and very few African borders respect or recognize the actual communities. They run right through communities, right? So every single country has a bunch of people who feel that they're not part of the state, and they need to have their own space. It's a big thing, and it then ties up the African Union in endless disputes, as you've seen with Western Sahara. So the African Union wants to avoid a lot of this, as much as they can.
Yeah. So knowing that China will stand with Somalia in the case of in the position of like, yes, we're going to stay, we're gonna support Somalia on that. And I do believe that Ted Cruz kind of exaggerated Somaliland importance to the U.S. national security. It's over. When you read the statement, there is a lot of exaggeration, like I mean, Somaliland, yes, they have access to the coast, but there's not the only country in access with the ocean. They have base, but they don't even have a base. But there's so many spaces there that the way they're portraying it as Somaliland is very important, and it also exaggerates importance of Somaliland to China. There's no specific or heavy importance for China
Well,
Somaliland in any shape and form.
Take a few things into account, and some of these folks who are advocating for Somaliland, who we won't talk about their names, are very, very angry with Somalia, and there is just a bitter depth of. There's no depth of the bitterness towards Somalia in the United States, and interestingly. In part because they feel that, again, remember, Black Hawk Down was a black eye for the United States. At the same time, they feel that the Somalis have, courted terrorists and have also wasted aid, and it's a corrupt government, and we can go on and on. It's basically a failed government in their view, and they feel very embittered about it. And this is one of the reasons why they want to promote a Somaliland alternative. Just also remember that Somalia and China are awkward kind of partners in all of this, because Somalia, Cobus, you'll remember this from our discussion on this a couple of years ago, was the only Muslim majority country, not once, but twice, that signed a joint statement supporting the people of Xinjiang against the treatment by the Chinese government. And that was something that the Chinese took very, very seriously and were very angry with Somalia. But here we are, Taiwan in the hierarchy of Chinese interests is paramount. And so everything is south of Taiwan when it comes to their priorities and their interests. So even though Somalia has gone against China on a very sensitive red line issue related to Xinjiang, apparently Taiwan is more important. So that's where we are. So Giraud, where does this go from here?
From here, I think that we're gonna keep on having those lobbyists and those U.S. lawmakers keep on pushing forward for Somaliland for recognition. But I think as long as they don't engage African countries, as long as there's no real engagement or a real support within the African continent, it's not going to go nowhere. But the problem is, for me, the problem is going to be the fact that it may create a momentum. If ever we see what we saw in South Sudan, where there is an administration that's kind of openly support that case, and given how African countries are now moving around the Trump administration, my concern is to see some African country cutting deals now, accepting cutting deals into a way that we agree that Somaliland can be an independent country, just to kind of soften their position or the stance with the US. This, for me, would be one of the main concerns to look for. For the moment, I see that Somaliland has little that no chance to be recognized as an independent country in short time period.
So my prediction is that Donald Trump will recognize Somaliland, because that's the kind of thing Donald Trump likes to do, likes to break the mold. I think the Americans will flood in a bunch of interest and a bunch of money into Somaliland as part of the MAGA foreign policy. Oh, I think just to prove a point. They love the idea of the port. They love the idea of what. No, but they've got the port. They're going to put logistics there. I think the Pentagon will set up some things there. The U.S. can do quite a bit. And I have a feeling that there's so much momentum now. And when Ted Cruz gets behind it, it becomes a bargaining chip between Cruz and the White House. And so, again, Cruz probably would not have gone out to do this had he not had the confidence that it's going to happen. That's my prediction. So I think by the year end, the U.S. will recognize. But again, it does not matter what the U.S. does. That does not make Somaliland a country.
Exactly.
Okay. So
exactly.
Let's leave it there. What a lively hour. We got to get in the habit of doing this. Giraud, I want to tell everybody about the great work that you are doing at Projet Afrique Chine. Tell folks what is going on there. We now have just 2 languages, but soon to have 3. Unfortunately, we had to close our Arabic service simply because, unfortunately, there wasn't as much interest in that as we thought there was going to be, unlike what we have with our French and our English service. So maybe you can tell folks about what you're doing over on Projet Afrique Chine.
In Projet Afrique Chine, we keep on covering China's engagement in Africa in French. We're really trying to shape the debate on what and how China is evolving and moving in the continent. We do that in French. We have podcasts, we have shows. We have shows on YouTube, but we still do that in English. We're really trying now to get to having some of those shows that we and comment that we make in French. But we also open to receiving. We start receiving contribution from journalists coming from Côte d'Ivoire, and here I'm gonna be announcing that yes, if you are a contributor, you're a journalist, you want to write a story related to China in your country, and I'm gonna emphasize it has to be a China-centered story around China engagement in your country, please contact us, right? Sorry, and we're gonna pay for that, and we pay for that.
Yeah,
just
we
so
pay.
it's not going to be for free. So we'd be happy to share those stories, especially if they bring very interesting insight on how China is moving in your country, and we'd like to do that in French. So coming from all the Francophone Africa, Western Africa, you hear us, you have stories, you have news to tell us about China engagement in your country, please reach out to us.
And also, just want to let everybody know of some of the cool things that we're developing over at the China Global South project, and it is really very exciting. We're about to launch our new Spanish language edition, and so we are in the process of looking for an editor right now. We're also going to be launching CGSP Intelligence later this year. That's going to be our new corporate service, and it's going to have lots of data and insights and videos and cool things for subscribers. We're developing new ways to sustain the business of actually running this whole operation. Also, just want to point out the great coverage that the rest of the team is doing. Like we just published today a story about Chinese EV mineral hunt in Zimbabwe and Arcadia Lithium and the complex relationship that the Chinese mining companies have with the community, both good and also some concerns. And so this is the kind of coverage that literally nobody else is doing. And Giraud and I were talking about this earlier. There's no one in the world has the team that we do, that every single day, Cobus and Giraud and Obert and Lucy, and we've got people in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and soon Latin America, who put all of this together. And it's just fantastic. I'm just so proud of the work that everybody's done and what they're doing. And if you'd like to support what we're doing, go over to ChinaGlobalSouth.com and you hit this. There's a subscribe button. We're logged in here, so it's not there, but go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. I should have the subscribe page up,
Exactly,
you know,
yeah.
that you're just.
And we have great content on YouTube as well. So we have
great content on YouTube as well.
So yeah.
So here's our subscribe page, and so want to check us out. And this work is what supports us. And here's the thing: if you don't support independent media, it goes away. It's that simple. That's the reality that we're facing today. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for another roundtable. We'll be back. I'd like to say we'll be back next week. I hope we'll be back next week. But
we just missed the last 2 weeks, but we're fine. So yeah.
We're gonna get back in there. So for Cobus in Johannesburg, it was I love that backdrop. And then for Giraud in Mauritius, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again very, very soon. Not sure when, with another edition of the CGSP Roundtable. Thanks for watching, guys. See you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.